Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to like the video, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe so you'll be here when the next story wakes. Now, let's begin. Lincoln School stood on a lonely patch of land, at the edge of town. Its roof sagging slightly under years of weather and its windows darkened by dust. It had been abandoned for more than a decade, but even after all that time, people still avoided walking past it after sunset. Some claimed the place felt colder than the rest of the hill. Some claimed the silence near the building was too deep, like a blanket pressing against your ears. And some claimed they heard sounds coming from inside, soft, rhythmic, childlike sounds, even though no one had stepped through those halls in years. The city assigned me there for night security, because I was one of the few who didn't complain about quiet shifts. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. Abandoned buildings didn't bother me much, they felt like forgotten stories, not threats. Still, something in my chest tightened when I saw the school from the parking lot that night. It wasn't fear. It was more like anticipation. Like the feeling right before opening a door you haven't touched in years. The moment I pushed open the front doors, a wave of cold air rolled over me. It carried the scent of old paint, damp books, and the faint sweetness of crayons long dried out. My flashlight beam stretched through the dim hallway, revealing flaking posters on the walls, lockers that had lost their shine, and long corridors that seemed to darken faster than the light could reach. My footsteps echoed softly at first, then slowly stretched into the distant corners of the building. The silence inside wasn't normal silence, it felt thick, like the air was holding its breath with me. I began my routine, walk the main hall, check the classrooms, make sure no one had forced a window or slipped inside. The first classroom held nothing, but dust-covered desks and scattered worksheets. The second had a fallen ceiling tile, and a faded bulletin board decorated with crumbling art projects. In the third, a chalkboard still had the faint outline of old lessons, written in chalk that had survived years of neglect. Everything seemed still. Then I reached classroom B. Just before my hand touched the door, I heard something inside. A soft, steady sound, the scratch of chalk against a board. I froze instantly. No one should have been inside the school at this hour. The building was locked, the windows sealed, the gates chained. And even if someone had snuck in, no one used chalk anymore. Teachers hadn't written on those boards in over 10 years. I leaned toward the door and listened. The sound continued, slow, deliberate strokes, then suddenly stopped, as if the room realized I was listening. "Security," I called, keeping my voice calm. "If someone's inside, say something." The silence that followed was too perfect, like the sound had been cut off mid-breath. I opened the door slowly, and let my flashlight sweep the room. Rows of desks sat neatly in their places, covered in dust. A teacher's table stood crooked near the window. The air inside felt colder than the hallway, almost untouched. Then my light landed on the chalkboard. Fresh handwriting, clear, bright, unmistakably new, stretched across the surface. At the top, written in neat, old-fashioned letters, was a single word. Present. Below it was a list of names. Names I had never seen before. Names no longer in any school record. Names belonging to students who weren't here anymore. And hadn't been here for many, many years. My chest tightened as I stepped closer. The handwriting looked like something from decades ago. Perfect loops, sharp edges, a teacher's practiced style. Then, before I could understand what I was seeing, the chalk in the tray shifted slightly, and began to rise. I stared, unable to move, as the chalk floated up and drew slowly across the board. Each stroke was steady and deliberate, forming another name, in the same careful handwriting. When it finished, the chalk lowered itself back into the tray with a gentle sound. The room felt alive. Not threatening, just aware. Something near the front row caught my eye, a small glint of pink reflecting in my flashlight beam. I crouched and picked it up. A girl's hair tie. Dusty on the outside, warm on the inside. Warm like someone had just been holding it. I stood again, and when I looked at the board, my breath caught in my throat. A new name had appeared. My name, written neatly, with an empty box beside it. As if waiting for me to mark myself present. I stared at the checkbox next to my name, unsure what the room wanted from me. The air didn't feel dangerous. It felt expectant, almost patient, like something was standing somewhere behind me, with its small hands folded, waiting for me to understand what it had asked. I stepped closer to the board, and the cold in the room shifted slightly, as if the air itself leaned toward me. My heartbeat echoed faintly in my ears. The chalk rested quietly in the tray, but the moment my hand hovered above it, I felt a strange warmth coming off it, almost like the warmth of a child's palm, left behind on a toy. I paused for a second, trying to convince myself, this wasn't some elaborate prank or sleep-deprived hallucination. But everything about the moment felt too real. Too deliberate, too close. With a slow breath, I picked up the chalk. A subtle warmth spread through my fingers, gentle and strangely familiar, like holding a memory that didn't belong to me. I lifted the chalk and pressed it lightly against the board, drawing a small checkmark next to my name. The room responded instantly. The air softened, warming by a degree that felt almost comforting. The silence around me loosened, no longer heavy or suffocating. And then something moved behind me, not loudly, not threateningly, but like soft, quick footsteps weaving between the desks. They were too light to belong to an adult. Too soft to be an animal, and too purposeful to be the building settling. I turned slowly, raising my flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just the rows of dusty desks, and the faint shimmer of chalk residue floating lazily in the air, drifting in the beam like tiny pale fireflies. My radio crackled suddenly from my belt, breaking the moment with a burst of static. "Marcus, status check. You good in there?" I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. "Yeah. I'm okay, still checking classroom B. You need backup?" I looked around the room again. The air had changed. Whatever was here didn't feel malicious. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt like a room full of children, holding their breath in a game of hide and seek, waiting for the seeker to turn around. "No," I said quietly. "No backup, I'm good." The radio clicked off, leaving me alone with the soft stillness. For a moment I wondered, if I imagined the warmth, the footsteps, the writing. But the hair tie in my pocket felt real. The checkmark beside my name felt real. The faint shift in the air felt real. I stepped back from the board, and let my flashlight wander across the room. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. On the far wall, beside the tall windows, there were child-height handprints in the dust. Not smudges, not random marks. Full handprints, small and clearly shaped, as if a group of children had run their palms across the wall long after the building had been locked and abandoned. I approached them slowly. The dust around the handprints was disturbed in streaks that suggested movement, like the prints weren't old, but recent, within the last hour, maybe within the last few minutes. The air behind me shifted suddenly, and I turned quickly. My flashlight hit the reflection of the teacher's desk. A small object sat on top that hadn't been there, moments before, a wooden name tag with a brass strip. I moved closer, my steps quiet on the dusty floor. When I leaned in to read it, my breath paused. Miss Harper. A teacher who used to work at Lincoln School before its closure. I remembered hearing her name in town once or twice, soft-spoken, kind, the sort of teacher who kept drawings from her students and taped them to every inch of her classroom walls. But she had passed away years before the school shut down. My fingers hovered over the dust-covered name tag. It wasn't warm like the hair tie, but it held a strange familiarity, like something left intentionally for me to find. I turned slightly, letting my flashlight sweep across the chalkboard again. The list of names suddenly meant something different. They weren't just random. They weren't a roll call for the building. They were attendants for her class. Children who had once been here. Children who had laughed in these desks. Children who had raised their hands for spelling tests, and whispered answers during reading time. Children who weren't here anymore. A subtle tightening pulled at the air again, as if someone small stood right beside me, waiting for my realization. "You're still here," I whispered before I even thought about the words, "all of you." The room felt lighter, as if it exhaled softly in response. For the first time since walking inside, I didn't feel like I was alone. A faint tapping sound came from the far corner of the room. Not sharp enough to be frightening, but rhythmic, like fingers brushing the side of a desk. I followed the sound slowly, weaving through the rows of seats. When I reached the corner, the tapping stopped, and my flashlight revealed a faded drawing, pinned to the bulletin board, a stick figure class portrait done in crayon. A row of children holding hands. A tall figure that looked like a teacher. Names written above their heads in shaky, childlike handwriting. The first name on the drawing matched the first name on the chalkboard, the second matched the second. The third matched the third. All the way to the bottom where, in a different color crayon, a final name had been added later, Miss Harper. My skin prickled at the realization that the drawing must have been made before the school closed, by one of the children on that list, but someone else had added her name afterward, using a different crayon. Someone who was still here. I looked toward the chalkboard again. The air in the room felt calmer now, almost peaceful, as if a quiet rest had returned to the walls. And then, gently, just as I was about to turn away, the chalk lifted once more. It didn't write a name this time, it didn't add anything to the list. It simply drew a small, slow heart beneath the names, and then the chalk lowered again, resting softly in the tray. For a moment I just stood there, feeling an ache in my chest I couldn't explain. Whatever these children were, memories, echoes, something more, they weren't trying to frighten me. They were trying to stay seen, they were trying to stay present. I stayed in the corner of the room for a moment longer, trying to understand what the chalk's final gesture meant. The small heart drawn under the names didn't feel childish. It felt intentional, like gratitude. The air around me had shifted into something gentler, almost warm, and even though I couldn't see anything, I felt a presence close enough to sense in the quiet. A soft creak came from the hallway beyond the door. Not aggressive, not sudden, just the sound of something settling. I walked back to the center of the classroom and glanced once more at the board. The list of names, the check marks, the heart, none of it felt threatening anymore. None of it felt strange in a dangerous way. If anything, it felt like I had stepped into a room full of children who had spent too long waiting for someone to acknowledge they were still there. As I turned to leave, the temperature dipped slightly, enough for me to feel a faint brush of cold against my arm. It felt like the light touch of a small hand. Not gripping, not pulling, just a gentle, fleeting goodbye. The kind of touch a child might give when they're not ready for someone to walk away just yet. I paused with my hand on the doorframe and whispered softly, "I won't forget you." The air warmed again, almost immediately, and for a brief moment I felt the quietest sense of relief move through the room, like an unseen group finally able to rest. When I stepped into the hallway, the building felt different. Still old, still sinking into itself, but lighter somehow. The oppressive silence had loosened, and the air no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It felt like a place that had finally been heard. I began walking toward the exit, my flashlight guiding me, past lockers and scattered papers left behind by time. Each step sounded softer than before, like the building's echo had softened its edges. As I moved deeper into the hallway, I turned once more toward classroom B. Its door, which had been completely still just moments before, now sat slightly ajar, just an inch. Not enough to be alarming. Just enough to feel like a final acknowledgement, a small motion to say that the night had shifted for both of us. Outside, the air felt warmer than it had when I first arrived. The sky still hung heavy with clouds, but the coldness of the building didn't follow me out. It stayed inside, where it belonged. When I reached my car, I pulled the hair tie from my pocket. Even now, away from the classroom, it held a faint warmth. It wasn't the warmth of a living hand, but it wasn't dead heat either. It felt like something caught between memory and presence, like a moment that had refused to fade. I sat in the car for a while, watching the dark outline of Lincoln School against the sky. In the quiet stillness, I thought about the attendance list, the chalk, the handprints, the drawing on the bulletin board, and the name tag with Miss Harper written across it. Maybe those children had stayed, because the building was the last place they felt safe. Maybe Miss Harper stayed because she wasn't ready to let go of them. Or maybe the place simply held every echo of every child, whoever sat in those desks, their laughter, their scribbles, their footsteps, all of it suspended in time. Whatever the truth was, I knew one thing. They weren't lost. They were waiting. And that night, for the first time in years, someone finally marked them present again. Before driving away, I looked at the school one last time. A single faint glow flickered through the dusty window of classroom B, not bright enough to be a flashlight or a street lamp reflection, just a thin, soft shimmer, like the last remnant of a memory slipping gently back into rest. I whispered quietly into the dark, "Good night." And the light faded. Schools have a strange kind of silence at night, deeper than the quiet that settles over empty buildings. It feels like the walls are holding on to the last whispers of the day, waiting for morning to return so the noise can fill them again. Redwood High looked ordinary during daylight, scattered papers, messy lockers, and hallways filled with the usual mix of laughter and stress. But at night, it felt like the school exhaled everything it had seen and kept only what it wanted. I had worked security shifts there for a couple of months. Most nights were uneventful. A few flickering lights, a faulty alarm panel, sometimes kids trying to sneak onto the football field. Nothing that couldn't be handled with a flashlight and a calm voice. But no one liked taking the East Wing. Even the daytime custodians avoided it unless they absolutely had to. Students whispered about the hallway like it had its own personality, something restless and watching. A few teachers joked that the lockers made noises at night, soft rattling and occasional dull thuds, but everyone laughed it off. Everyone except the guards. We didn't talk about it much, but every new hire learned the same thing within a few weeks. Locker 213 never stayed shut. The night my shift rotation put me on that wing, the temperature outside had dropped sharply. By the time I reached the east corridor, the air inside felt even colder than the parking lot. The lights flickered every few seconds, buzzing faintly like they were struggling to stay awake. My shoes echoed softly along the long stretch of lockers. Most were spotless from disuse, but some were covered in stickers that had half peeled away, leaving ghostly outlines behind. It felt like walking through a place frozen halfway between memory and neglect. When I reached the center of the hallway, I saw it. Locker 213, slightly open. Not wide enough to be concerning, but enough to feel wrong, like a mouth parting in a small breath. I pushed the locker shut again, firmly enough that the metal shuddered lightly. For a few seconds, everything stayed quiet. Then a soft, single thud echoed from inside the locker, like fingertips tapping metal. I stepped back without realizing it. Another tap, louder this time, more deliberate. Something about the sound wasn't random. It was slow, measured, like someone trying to get attention. "Who's in there?" I whispered before I even thought about it. The hallway absorbed the words. No echo, no reply. Just a faint drop in temperature, enough to see my breath. Against my better judgment, I reached for the locker handle again and pulled it open. Another folded paper sat inside. This one wasn't crumpled. It looked placed, carefully, almost gently, like someone had wanted it to be found. I unfolded it slowly. "Don't leave it open. He watches from the gap." The moment I read the sentence, the hallway behind me creaked softly, and I spun around. No one, nothing. Just the hum of weak fluorescent lights. I shut the locker quickly, pressing hard until the latch snapped loudly. My hand stayed on the door for a few seconds, waiting to feel movement, but the metal stayed still and cold. Then something brushed the back of my neck. A faint pressure, not a breeze, not AC. A cold whisper of air that felt like breath. I whipped around instantly, raising my flashlight higher. The hallway behind me was empty. Silent, except for one thing. Locker 213 was open again. And written inside the door, smeared in something dark I couldn't identify, was one more message. Stop closing it, you're making him angry. My mouth went dry. There was no dust on the letters. Whatever wrote that? Wrote it moments ago. I took a slow step back, my breath catching slightly as the cold around me deepened. The air felt tight, like something unseen was standing far too close. Then, from deep inside the locker, I heard a sound that froze me completely. A slow inhale, like something taking its first breath after being locked away. The inhale coming from inside the locker wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, too real. A sound shaped by lungs, or something pretending to have lungs. It sent a tight shiver across my arms, the kind that makes every instinct tell you to back away slowly. But I didn't move. Not because I was brave, but because it felt like the locker was waiting for me to react, like whatever was inside wanted me to step back so it could step forward. I lifted my flashlight, my hand trembling slightly as the beam cut across the metal frame. The locker interior was still black, deeper than it should have been. Like the darkness wasn't just shadow, like it had weight. Another breath drifted out, this one slower, and colder. It slid across the floor like mist you could almost see. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. Who's in there? Silence. Not even the hum of the lights now. Just the quiet of something listening. I took a few steps back, keeping my flashlight pointed at the open locker. The corridor stretched behind me, empty and still, but it felt like the walls were leaning closer, like the entire hallway was watching. Then the locker door moved. A small, soft shift. Forward, then back. Like someone inside was pressing a hand against it. My pulse spiked instantly. I raised the beam higher. Metal should reflect even the faintest light, but the darkness inside wasn't reacting at all. It swallowed the flashlight beam instead of bouncing it. Something whispered. A low sound. Not a word, not even a breath this time. Just the sound of presence, close, aware, patient. I stepped back farther, reaching for the radio clip to my belt. But before my fingers even touched it, the lights in the east wing flickered rapidly, buzzing louder than before. Then they went out. Everything dropped into blackness. For a few seconds, the only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears. The flashlight became the only slice of existence I could hold on to, and even that felt too weak. The inhale came again, not from the locker. This time, it came from right behind me. I spun around so fast that the flashlight blurred across the hallway. Nothing was there. But the air behind me was colder than the rest of the corridor, sharp enough to sting my throat when I breathed in. I forced myself to turn back toward the locker. In the dark, with only a narrow flashlight beam to cut through the stillness, the open metal door looked wrong, like it was wider than before, like the edges were bending outward for something larger to crawl through. Then I noticed the third note. Not inside the locker, not on the door. But on the floor, placed perfectly in the center of the narrow hallway, as if someone had set it there while I turned away for those few seconds. I didn't want to pick it up. Every instinct said I shouldn't. But I crouched down anyway, my hand shaking as I reached for the paper. It felt warm, unsettlingly warm, like someone had just been holding it. I unfolded it slowly, my throat tightened. He doesn't like the dark. Don't let it stay open in the dark. A chill crawled through my chest. I looked back at the locker. Still open. Darkness spilling from it like a curtain with no folds. Another inhale drifted through the hallway. This one sounded bigger. I backed away, step by step, forcing myself to breathe evenly, keeping the flashlight steady. For a moment I considered running, just sprinting down the hallway and out the nearest exit. But the school was enormous at night. And I had learned something over the months working there. When something follows you in the dark, distance doesn't matter. Turning your back does. A faint sound came from the locker, a creak. Then a slow, dragging scrape, like something inside had shifted closer to the doorway. My chest tightened. The flashlight flickered. I slapped the side of it instantly, desperate not to lose the only thing keeping the darkness from feeling alive. For a split second the beam died completely. In that split second, I heard something step out of the locker. When the light snapped back on, nothing was there. But the locker door, the metal door that had been wide open, was slowly, quietly closing on its own, moving with an unnatural smoothness, like someone invisible was pulling it shut. It didn't slam, it didn't click. It just eased into place, sealing the dark inside again. My breaths came fast now, uneven, ragged. I wanted to radio someone, anyone, but the hallway felt wrong, like speaking too loudly would wake something that shouldn't be disturbed. Then my radio crackled softly on its own. A faint static whisper cut through the silence. And underneath that static, I heard a voice. A child's voice, quiet, tired, hidden under the crackle. Don't leave. The flashlight dipped in my hand. The voice came again, clearer this time. He wants you to stay. And then the locker door rattled violently, like something inside was throwing itself against the metal. Once, twice, harder each time. My body moved before my mind did. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway, the flashlight beam shaking wildly across the walls. The lockers seemed to blur together as I passed, every slamming heartbeat louder than the last. Behind me, I heard the metal crash one more time. A final, heavy strike. And then silence. A silence that didn't feel empty, a silence that felt like footsteps were following just far enough behind to stay hidden. I didn't stop running until I reached the central lobby, the only part of the school that still felt connected to the living world. The lights here were brighter, humming steadily without flicker. The faint glow from the vending machines and the receptionist's desk grounded me enough to finally breathe. I stood there for a moment, leaning on my knees, letting the adrenaline settle. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, but slowly the panic faded just enough for me to think clearly. Locker 213 had never moved like that before. No one had ever mentioned a voice. And definitely no one had heard a child. I walked toward the security office, forcing myself not to look back down the long hallway that led to the east wing, even though I felt something waiting in that darkness, just outside the reach of the light. Inside the office, everything was as I'd left it. The monitors glowed dimly, each screen divided into grainy camera feeds from around the building. I dropped into the chair, still breathing hard, and rewound the footage from the east hallway. For the first few minutes, everything looked normal. Just me walking, me closing the locker. Me turning away, stepping down the hall. Then the locker door opened, by itself. I leaned in closer, my fingers tightening on the desk. The feed was fuzzy, but clear enough to show the door swinging out slowly, stopping at the same angle it had when I first saw it. But the real shock came next. A shadow fell across the floor. Not mine, not shaped like any person. It was low and thin, long-limbed, almost crawling in form, like it was stretching itself from inside the locker even though nothing visible stepped out. The shadow slid across the tiles for a moment, then snapped back out of sight. I froze, blinking slowly as the time stamp advanced. Then I saw the next moment, the one that shouldn't have been possible. There was a frame where I wasn't alone. It lasted only half a second, a flicker between feeds. The glitch was faint, but clear enough to see that something stood right behind me. A shape leaning forward, almost resting its head near my shoulder. Tall, with arms far too long, fingers reaching down past what could ever be called human. Then the frame cut to static, and a split second later I was running, as if my body had sensed it even if my eyes hadn't. My hands felt cold as I leaned back in the chair. I replayed the footage again. That impossible frame flashed by once more, and my stomach twisted. Something else bothered me too. The camera time stamp wasn't matching my actual movement. For a full minute before I ran, the footage showed me standing perfectly still. Facing locker 213. Not turning, not speaking, not breathing quickly. Just standing there, motionless, like I was listening to something. I didn't remember that, not even for a second. I rubbed my face and stood up, pacing across the small room. The walls felt closer now, like the office had shrunk without me noticing. I grabbed my radio to call the watch commander, but before I pressed the button, it crackled again. The same child's voice. Only now it sounded closer, more clear. Almost like someone whispering directly into the speaker grill. You closed it again. I dropped the radio onto the desk. The cameras flickered, one by one. A wave of static rolled across the screens from left to right. The hallways disappeared. The classrooms vanished. One feed held on longer than the others. The East Wing, and locker 213, open. But this time, there was something inside. A shape curled in the darkness. Not a person, not an outline I could fully understand. Just the suggestion of limbs twisted in angles that defied sense, and a head tilted wrong, almost backward. The moment my eyes locked onto the shape, the camera feed froze. Then the shape moved, slowly, deliberately. It lifted one long arm and pressed a hand against the inside of the locker door, pushing it wider. The screen glitched as the door creaked open on camera, widening and widening until the darkness filled almost the entire feed. Then another hand appeared at the edge of the frame, then another. Like it had more limbs than it needed. The last thing the camera showed before cutting to black was something leaning out from the locker, long fingers curling around the metal edge. The office went silent. The quiet pressed so hard on my ears that I thought the whole school had gone deaf. I reached slowly for the room door, every instinct telling me not to open it. Then I heard it, a soft inhale. Right outside the office door. I didn't breathe, I didn't blink. Another inhale followed, long and slow, pulling the air out of the hallway like something tasting the building. The metal handle twitched. I stepped back. The handle twitched again. Then slowly, gently, like a child tapping politely, something scraped a long fingernail down the other side of the door. Once, twice, then a final drag that left a faint indentation in the paint. My heartbeat trembled, so hard I could feel it in my throat. Silence settled again. I didn't move for several minutes. Maybe 10, maybe more. When I finally opened the office door later that night, the hallway was empty. The air was cold. And in the far distance, all the way down the east wing, locker 213 stood wide open. A single piece of folded paper lay in the hallway outside the office, placed neatly where I would see it. I bent down slowly and picked it up. The message inside was written in that same hurried, frantic handwriting as before. Stop closing it. You didn't see what came out this time. I stared at the note for what felt like forever. And then, as I lowered the paper from my hands, I saw it. A faint shadow at the end of the hall. Long, still, waiting. And the locker behind it, slowly closing on its own. As if something had just returned to it. Or something else had left. The classroom where attendance never matches. They moved me to the north wing because I kept showing up on time and I didn't argue about long shifts. The school district liked that kind of reliability in a guard, someone who would sit through nights without calling in sick, someone who would log the hours and go home and not talk about the way old buildings made sounds that felt like memories. The north wing of Everly High had its own reputation. Teachers who'd retired years ago still mentioned it in hushed tones at the staff reunion dinners, with awkward laughs that didn't reach their eyes. They said things like the ventilation system whistled names sometimes, or that the intercom picked up voices if you stood near the art room after 2 a.m. I'd heard those stories and smiled, the way you do when you don't want to show you're listening. There is a difference between hearing a rumor and standing in a hallway where the rumor seems to breathe. My first night there I walked the usual route. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired song. Lockers lined up like satisfied teeth. The smell of paper and old glue sat in corners where projects had been hurriedly left when summer came early. I checked the doors, logged the times, took the occasional sip from a cold thermos. It was routine, until the logbook in my pocket began to feel heavier in a way that had nothing to do with ink. It began with a page missing. Not completely torn out, but folded, the corner creased like someone had tucked a note into the spine of the book and never returned to it. I flipped through the entries from the previous night, expecting the dry monotony of names and timestamps, but found a single line penciled in between the neat hours. Attendance does not match. I frowned and tapped the page with my thumb. The handwriting belonged to no officer I knew. It was small and hurried, as if the writer had been trying to make a note while listening. I closed the book with more care than a missing page warranted and kept walking, telling myself 1,000 plausible things. Maybe a substitute had left a note. Maybe some officer on the prior shift had been distracted. Buildings hide explanations like loose floorboards hide dust, out of sight until someone steps wrong. By midnight, I had checked the classrooms on that wing twice, then a third time just to be sure the door to the art room was still locked. The room felt like a sealed memory, paint jars dried in their trays and half-finished canvases leaning against a shelf. I stood there for a long minute and felt my breath fog in the cold light, thinking about the note in the logbook and the quiet that settles in over places that once had voices. That was when I noticed the small post-it stuck to the inside of the art room door, half folded, half hidden under tape. It was a pale yellow rectangle with 3 words written in tiny careful letters. Attendance wrong again. I pulled the post-it free and felt an odd pressure in my fingers, like the paper was warmer than it should be. The writing was the same cramped style as the note in the logbook, but there was a small smudge of graphite at the corner, as if whoever had written it had stopped and smudged the ink with their thumb before moving on. The air seemed to thicken then, the kind of heaviness that announces a presence rather than a sound. I had been on enough night shifts to recognize that feeling, the one that tells you to do something simple, like leave the room or check the cameras, before something else decides to tell you whether it's friendly. I taped the post-it into my pocket and went to the security station to review the footage. If something odd was happening on that wing, the cameras would show it. Cameras don't lie. People do. Cameras catch what the lights miss. The feed played back the hallway in the grainy monotone I'd come to trust, my boots showing as a small moving shadow across the tile. For the first 20 minutes it showed nothing of note, a janitor will pass with a trash can, the late-night maintenance truck idling outside. Then at 12:08 the feed stuttered and blipped, and for a single frame something strange appeared, a cluster of small shapes where no one should have been, like the outline of little heads just visible above the desks. When I rewound the footage, that single frame stretched to 3, to 5, then returned to normal, as if the camera had been compensating for a lag. The desk area remained empty. My mouth went dry. If I had not seen those frames, I might have written them off as an artifact, but they were there, sharp and sudden, and then gone. The logbook note came back into my mind, and I felt the same weight settle low in my stomach. I decided to do what any guard would do. I made a second round through the classrooms, moving slower this time, my flashlight beam steady. At the door to classroom 307, the wood looked scuffed and the nameplate hung crooked. On impulse I tapped the door. It produced a dull echo inside, like someone had been waiting for that sound. I pushed the door open and stepped into a room that time had left almost neat. Desks arranged in rows, a shelf of novels, a globe with a faded map. On the teacher's desk, a small stack of attendance sheets lay folded, as if someone had placed them there and walked away. I picked up the top sheet and smoothed it in my hands. It was filled with names in a neat type, as if someone had printed them from an old database, and then someone else had written checks and little notes beside certain entries. Most lines had a check, but a few boxes remained empty. The top of the page had a header scrawled in the same cramped writing I had seen earlier. Attendance does not match. Reconcile. I ran my thumb along the margin and found a small pencil mark where someone had tried to correct a name, crossing out an entry and replacing it with another. The handwriting was uncertain here, the letters wavering as if the writer doubted their own memory. When I walked back to the doorway, I felt the room breathe in a way that made the hair on my arms rise. The radio at my hip felt suddenly too loud. For a moment I thought about calling in the incident and letting the day watch commander decide what to do. But calling it in felt like admitting I couldn't handle a building where paper could argue with memory. I slid the attendance sheet into my pocket. If this was something that repeated itself, I wanted a record of it. I wanted to prove to myself that the peculiar had happened, and not just to my nerves. I turned to leave the room and noticed, pinned to the board near the front, a list of names in childlike scrawl. The list matched the printed roster for classroom 307, but under a few of the names, in a different handwriting, someone had added short notes: sat by window, left early, not in class today. The notes were mundane, the kind of scraps a teacher would make to remember who had been excused or absent. But the last line had a different tone to it. It was written smaller, cramped into the corner, and read: "We counted 12 yesterday. We count 11 today." I stood there for a long time with that line in my head. Counting is a simple thing, a basic habit we learn when we begin to make sense of the world. For the building to hold on to that practice after it was empty felt less like a ghost story and more like a small, stubborn grief. Whoever kept making these notes seemed to be arguing with a memory that wouldn't stay quiet. When I left classroom 307 that night, the post-it still in my pocket felt heavier than before, as if the paper had absorbed something from the air. I made another slow round of the hallways, listening to the quiet for anything that felt like a voice. For now, the school gave me only its usual complaints: a heater that rattled in time with my pulse, a distant hum like a refrigerator that had forgotten its purpose. Back at the security station, I taped the attendance form onto the wall beside the monitor and stared at it for a long time. The logbook on my desk had a new line penciled in by someone earlier in the night. Reconcile attendance. He counts wrong. I read the sentence twice and then laughed once, the sound small and sharp in the empty room. Saying something out loud sometimes clears it. It did not clear this. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a conversation I hadn't agreed to join. I shut off the monitors and locked the office door for a moment, more to create a ritual of separation than for any practical protection. I felt watched, not in the obvious way of a camera, but in that shallow, constant way that makes you certain you are not alone even when the hallway appears empty. I sat down with a fresh cup of coffee and tried to organize my thoughts. The evidence on paper suggested a pattern: notes left in different places, the same cramped handwriting, camera glitches that caught flashes of movement, and an attendance record that contradicted itself. Each piece on its own could be explained. Together, they made something stubborn and quietly insistent. Sometime after 2, as the building slumbered in fitful light, my radio clicked to life and a voice came over with a standard status check. I answered, but when I glanced down at the attendance sheet pinned to the wall, I thought I saw the checks rearrange themselves ever so slightly, like the ink was still settling into the paper. I blinked hard and leaned closer, telling myself it was fatigue. And then I heard it, a soft, methodical whisper from the corridor outside, like someone counting under their breath. 1, 2, 3. I sat very still, listening. The whisper continued, and as it did, the hairs on my arms lifted in a slow, certain rhythm. The counting stopped as suddenly as it began. The hallway outside the office returned to its usual stale quiet, but the silence didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like someone holding their breath, waiting to see if I noticed. I stepped into the corridor, flashlight steady, and listened. Nothing moved. The air was unmoving, too still for a building with aging vents. I walked toward classroom 307 because the counting felt connected to that room in a way my instincts already understood. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, like walls holding onto something they weren't meant to contain. When I reached the door, I felt a thin draft from the bottom of the frame, colder than the rest of the hallway. I pushed the door open gently. The room looked exactly as I had left it, desks in neat rows, papers stacked on the teacher's desk, the attendance sheets untouched. But the pressure in the air was different now, as if the room was aware of me. I stepped inside and noticed something small but immediately wrong. The chalkboard had writing on it. I knew it had been clean earlier. I would have remembered the pale smudges of chalk. Now there were numbers written across it, 1 to 12, in a shaky hand. The numbers weren't neatly aligned, they slanted unevenly, stretching across the board like someone had written them in a rush. Under number 12, a small note was scribbled. Missing again. I stared at the words, the chalk dust still fresh, flakes scattered below like something had brushed off the board only moments ago. I reached out and touched the chalk marks. They smudged instantly. Someone had been here. The room seemed to press closer, like it was waiting for something, or someone. I walked to the desk in the corner, the one where I'd found the attendance sheet earlier. A new page sat on top now, freshly placed, the edges a little curled like someone had handled it with nervous fingers. The handwriting matched the earlier notes. We counted 11 yesterday, we count 10 today. A cold tightness spread across my chest. I turned toward the door and froze. Someone was standing in the hallway. Not fully visible, just the outline of a small figure reflected in the dim light outside the classroom. A child, maybe 8 or 9, standing perfectly still. Their head was tilted slightly toward me, like they were waiting for permission to enter. I lifted my flashlight slowly, the hallway was empty. The figure was gone. I moved toward the door carefully, listening to each breath I took. When I stepped into the hallway, the building suddenly felt impossibly long, like the distance between classroom doors had stretched silently behind my back. Something small lay on the floor just outside the threshold, a pencil. Yellow. Worn down almost to the nub. Teeth marks along the wood. I crouched and picked it up. The pencil was warm, too warm. As though a hand, or something having a hand, had been holding it moments earlier. I slipped the pencil into my pocket and walked slowly down the corridor. My footsteps sounded wrong, each step followed by a faint echo that didn't match the rhythm. Like something was stepping after me, slightly out of sync. At the end of the hall, near the stairwell, a faint tapping sound began, slow, measured. Like someone tapping a desk with a fingertip. Tap, tap, tap. I followed the sound cautiously, letting the flashlight guide me. The tapping continued as I approached, steady and patient. When I turned toward the math room, the sound stopped. I opened the door. Desks were arranged as neatly as always. A half-erased equation covered part of the whiteboard. Nothing out of place. But then I noticed the attendance sheet on the teacher's podium. Not printed, not typed, handwritten. 12 names again. Each name had a small circle next to it, for attendance, presumably. 10 had X marks. 2 circles were empty. At the bottom of the sheet, a tiny scribble read. Find the missing 2, before he counts again. A cold ripple ran through my spine. As I held the paper, something shifted behind me. The sound of a desk leg scraping the floor. I turned sharply, nothing moved. But one desk near the back row was slightly angled, as though someone had gotten up from it in a hurry. I stepped toward it slowly. A faint, childlike whisper floated through the room. 10. Not loud, not clear. Just a soft voice trying to finish a count. I froze in place. The whisper came again, closer this time. 11. My mouth went dry. I backed away toward the door, keeping the flashlight pointed at the rows of desks. Then the last whisper reached me. So close it felt like it brushed my ear. 12. My flashlight flickered. When the beam steadied again, I wasn't alone. A small outline sat in the back chair, unmoving, faint, like a shadow with shape but no face. Its head turned slightly toward me, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew it was looking directly at me. I stepped back into the doorway, pulse hammering in my throat. The figure didn't stand, didn't vanish, didn't move. It just sat there, waiting. And then, slowly, the attendance sheet in my hand changed temperature, growing warm, almost hot, as if someone unseen had placed their hand against mine. I looked down. Something new had appeared at the bottom of the page, the writing forming right in front of me, pencil strokes emerging one by one as if guided by an invisible hand. He counted 12 again, "You shouldn't be here." Before I could react, a loud crash echoed down the hallway, locker doors slamming shut in a chain reaction, one after another. A violent chorus of metal clanging in sequence. Something was moving through the building. And it was counting. The locker slams echoed through the building like a wave, rolling from one end of the hallway to the other. Each metallic crash felt sharper than the last, bouncing off the walls, turning the school into a chamber of hollow sound. I gripped the attendance sheet tightly as the echoes faded into a tense, suffocating quiet. The shadowy figure in the back desk hadn't moved. It sat perfectly still, head tilted, hands resting on the desk in a way that looked too calm for the chaos happening outside. But something about it felt older than a child. Not older in years, but older in weight, the weight of something lingering too long. I took a slow breath and stepped backward into the hallway. My flashlight beam shook slightly, the circle of light trembling across the tile. The desks inside the classroom creaked softly, as if shifting under invisible weight. Then the counting started again. A low, layered whisper, rising from somewhere deeper in the building. 1. I turned toward the stairs. The voice echoed again, louder this time. 2. The air grew thicker, like the hallways were closing themselves off. I could almost feel the walls contracting around me, urging me to move, pushing me away from the classroom as if they were trying to protect me, or trap me. I hurried down the corridor, pulse hammering, each footstep mirrored by another faint step behind me. 3. The voice wasn't a child's voice now. It was deeper, worn. Something counting not students, but people who wandered too close. I reached the stairwell and descended quickly, my hand brushing the railing. The air downstairs was colder, heavy with the smell of old concrete. When I reached the landing, I stopped short. There was another attendance list taped to the wall. Fresh ink, still drying. 12 names. But this time, every circle was checked. Even the last two, the ones that had always remained empty. Someone had filled them in. Next to the final checkmark, another line had been added in shaky handwriting. He found them, now he wants more. My stomach tightened. The counting echoed again, now directly behind me, closer than before. 4. I turned, flashlight up, ready for anything. But the hallway was empty. No shadowed figure, no child, no person at all. Just the sound of another locker slamming somewhere behind me. I walked quickly toward the administrative office, each step pushing me further from the sound. My boots struck the tiled floor in a rushed rhythm that mixed with the faint whispering behind me. 5. At the end of the hallway, the office door stood slightly open. The room inside glowed with the soft light of the computer monitors. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind me. The cameras flickered. Every screen glitched for a moment, static crawling along the edges before stabilizing. The feed for classroom 307 popped up first. The desk sat in perfect silence, but the figure in the back chair was gone. My breath caught. The screen flickered again. This time, the camera showed the second floor. And a small figure standing in the middle of the hallway. Its head tilted. Long fingers brushing the lockers. Waiting. The feed flickered once more and the figure vanished. Then reappeared 2 cameras closer to my location. The counting continued. 6. I backed away from the screens. 7. The radio on the desk crackled violently, spitting static. Beneath the noise, a voice whispered. "He's finishing attendance." 8. Lockers down the hallway began to rattle again. Rhythmic, deliberate, like a roll call being forced into the walls. 9. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Something scraped the office door. A single, slow drag. The sound of long nails tracing the paint. 10. The lights in the office dimmed, then steadied. Then dimmed again. The air felt heavier with each breath. The scraping returned. This time accompanied by soft tapping, like knuckles knocking. But not knocking to come in. Knocking to count. 11. The handle twitched. My legs tensed automatically. I pressed my back against the far wall, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. The handle twitched again. Then the whisper came from right outside the door. A voice layered, not one person but many, speaking in a low, breathless tone. "You're the 12th. My chest tightened painfully. The door knob turned slowly, then back. Then forward again. As though someone was feeling the motion, enjoying the anticipation. I stepped to the side of the door, holding my breath. Then, complete silence. No tapping, no scraping, no footsteps. Even the hum of the electronics faded. The quiet felt wrong, too perfect. I waited for something, anything, to move. Then, softly, right beside my ear, inside the room. 12. The lights flickered violently. Every screen on the monitors warped, then cleared, showing all 12 desks in classroom 307. Every desk filled, even the last one. A cold hand brushed my shoulder. I spun around. But nothing was there. Only the faint outline of a small handprint, perfectly visible on my shirt sleeve, fading slowly like chalk dust returning to the floor. The room felt empty again, but not safe, never safe. Because when I dared to look back at the attendance sheet taped to the office wall, a new line had been added at the bottom. No handwriting this time. Just a printed sentence. As if the paper itself had changed. Attendance matches tonight. You shouldn't come back. And underneath it, the faintest pencil mark circled one final word. 12. The principal's office that unlocks itself. They don't assign guards to the administrative wing unless they trust you. That's what my supervisor told me the evening I received the new rotation. The admin wing was considered quiet, a place where nothing happened except paperwork and the kind of silence that comes from too many closed doors. But everyone who worked the day shift knew one thing. The principal's office never stayed locked at night. For years, they said the lock jammed, or the door frame shifted, or the building settled wrong. Everyone had a different excuse. But all the excuses had one thing in common. None of them explained why the door opened from the inside. I didn't think much of it at first. Doors move. Old hinges groan. Schools breathe differently after midnight. I'd convinced myself of all of that before my first night on the new assignment. That confidence lasted until I reached the admin hall just after 12:30. Most of the building slept in darkness, but the admin wing was always partially lit. A soft glow from the emergency bulbs created long, stretched shadows up and down the corridor. The polished floors reflected just enough light to make everything feel too clean, too deliberate. As I walked toward the end of the hall, something felt off. Like the entire wing was waiting. I slowed my steps. The principal's office was the last room on the right. A brass nameplate hung crooked beneath the window. The door itself sat tightly in the frame, and the lock was turned horizontal, the locked position. I reached out to check it. Before my fingers touched the knob, it turned on its own. Just a small shift, soft, subtle. But enough to send a cold ripple straight up my spine. I froze, listening. The hallway fell silent. Then, click. The door unlocked. The knob turned a little more, slowly, gently, like someone on the other side had placed their hand over mine and guided the motion. I stepped back, pulse tightening. The door eased open by half an inch. The shifting air carried out something cold, not a smell exactly, but a sensation. A kind of stillness that felt too deliberate for an empty room. I pushed the door fully open. The office looked normal enough. Desk. Filing cabinets. A shelf of dusty awards from the mid-2000s. A small collection of outdated student yearbooks stacked near the wall. Nothing out of place. Nothing disturbed. Except one thing. A single light was on inside the room. The desk lamp. Someone had pulled the chain. I approached the desk carefully, scanning every corner before stepping closer. The papers on the surface were neatly stacked, except for one envelope lying in the center, sealed and slightly crumpled as though it had been handled recently. My name was written on it. A tight chill crawled down my stomach. I picked up the envelope slowly. It felt warm. I opened it. Inside was a page torn from an old attendance ledger. At the top, written in a rushed hand, were 3 words. "He's in here." My throat tightened. The office suddenly felt smaller. I stepped back, instinctively checking the doorway. The hall outside was empty, no footsteps, no movement, only the soft hum of the lights. A faint sound drifted from behind the desk. Not a creak, not a thud, breathing. I leaned forward slowly, crouching just enough to see behind the desk. No one was there. The breathing stopped. I stood again, scanning the room with sharper focus now. Every detail felt wrong, the slant of the chair, the open binder on the file cabinet, the faint scratch marks on the floor near the door. Someone had been pacing inside, a lot. My radio crackled suddenly, static. Then a faint voice buried under the noise. So faint I almost missed it. "Don't lock it." I stepped closer to the radio. The whisper repeated, this time clearer. "Don't lock him inside." A cold weight settled behind my ribs. In that exact moment, something tapped the inside of the principal's office door. Once, then again, harder. I spun around. The door, which I had left fully open, was slowly, incredibly slowly, swinging shut. Not like the wind pushed it, but like someone behind it was guiding the motion inch by inch. I lunged forward and grabbed the edge before it closed completely. The pressure on the door instantly increased, like someone was pushing back from the other side, hard. I braced my feet against the tile and shoved with both hands, but the other force remained steady and deliberate, not violent, just insistent, almost calm. Then the pushing stopped. The door relaxed in my grip. A faint whisper drifted through the thin space between the door and the frame, brushing my cheek like cold breath. "You shouldn't have opened it." I stumbled backward, letting the door swing fully open again. The room was empty, the chair perfectly still. The lamp glowing softly. But the air felt wrong. As if whoever whispered was still standing right beside me, watching how I breathed. Watching whether I moved. I backed toward the hallway, keeping my eyes on the desk the entire time. Just before I stepped out of the room, my gaze dropped to the floor. A fresh mark, a long, thin scratch, ran across the tile, stopping exactly where my boot now stood. And at the end of that scratch, written in the dust with a fingertip, were 2 words. Don't leave. My breath caught. Behind me, the hallway lights dimmed. And somewhere deeper in the building, a door slammed, hard. The kind of slam that meant something had just been let out. Or something had just been locked in. I stepped into the hallway, heart pounding with that tight, hollow rhythm that only comes when you know something isn't over, just paused. The admin corridor stretched long and straight ahead, but the light felt thinner now, weaker, like the bulbs were trying not to show me something. The slam I heard earlier had come from deeper inside the wing, near the counseling rooms or the old storage office. Those doors were never used at night. No one had keys for them except daytime staff. But the sound had been too heavy, too sharp, too intentional to ignore. I began walking, slow and careful, keeping my flashlight steady. My boots made soft thumps against the tile, but every few steps, I heard a second sound underneath. Not an echo, not delayed footsteps. Just a faint pressure in the air, like someone was walking just out of sync with me. I passed a bulletin board filled with faded photos, science fair winners, spelling bee champions, a smiling principal shaking hands with a student in a cap and gown, all normal. Except one photo. In the picture of the principal with last year's graduating class. Someone was standing behind him. A tall figure, blurred but unmistakably present. A shape the camera had caught but the students clearly hadn't seen. Long arms, head lowered, standing at the very edge of the row. I leaned closer, feeling a cold ripple down my back. The shape wasn't a shadow from the trees or a reflection. It was too defined, too centered. Almost as if the camera had focused on it instead of the principal. I stepped away quickly. That's when I noticed the door to the records room. It was open. Only a few inches, but enough to reveal total darkness inside, the kind that swallows the light instead of holding it. I pushed the door fully open. The air inside was cold and stale, thick with old paper and dust. Shelves rose on both sides, filled with brown folders, boxes, and binders labeled with decades of student names. I took one step in. The door behind me clicked. I spun around. It hadn't closed, it had locked from the inside. A thin weight crept across my chest. I reached for the knob, twisting it sharply. It didn't move. Then I heard it. A light scraping sound in the far corner of the room. Something shifting slowly. I lifted my flashlight. The beam cut through the dust-filled air and landed on a single file drawer near the back of the shelves. Drawer 114, it was pulled open. Just a few inches, not enough for a file to fall out, but enough to show it hadn't been closed properly. As I watched, the drawer shifted another inch. Not jerking, sliding, like someone resting a hand on it from the other side. I swallowed and walked toward it, the air tightening as I approached. The folder on top was labeled. Incident Report, Office 01. Dated 10 years ago. I opened it slowly. Inside were pages yellowed with age, handwritten entries from staff, and a typed summary clipped to the front. A name appeared repeatedly. Daniel Rhodes, former student, age 14. I flipped to the second page. A note scribbled by a teacher read. Door in principal's office unlocked again. Child keeps returning. But he's not on today's attendance. My pulse stilled. Another page had a faded photograph, a class picture. All smiling kids. Except one boy in the corner. Head slightly down, face blurred, arms too long for his sleeves. I didn't even realize I was whispering the name out loud. Daniel. The moment I said it, something shifted behind the file shelves. Not a small sound, a full-bodied shuffle, like someone adjusting their weight. I slowly turned the flashlight toward the noise. The beam landed on the narrow space between 2 shelves. Something stood there. Not fully visible, just a tall, dark outline pressed between the shelves, too thin to be human, too still to be alive, too patient to be anything normal. Its head slowly lifted. Not fast, not sudden, just enough. Enough to show it knew I saw it. The flashlight flickered once, then again. The figure moved, a single step forward. I stumbled back, the folder falling from my hands, papers scattering across the tile. My breath hitched as the figure leaned out from behind the shelves. Its arm, impossibly long, brushed lightly against a stack of old yearbooks, pushing them just enough to make them fall. One hit the ground with a dull thud. The sound broke something. I bolted toward the door, grabbed the knob with shaking hands, and twisted. It turned, unlocked. I threw the door open and rushed into the hallway, gasping for breath. The corridor felt different now, warmer, normal, but my pulse wouldn't slow. Behind me, the records room door stood ajar. A small sound drifted out, a whisper. Not words, not breath, just counting. Slow, deliberate. 1. I backed away. Then the principal's office door, the one I had left open earlier, slammed shut with a violent force. The whole hallway shook. I turned toward it, frozen. A new piece of paper slid out from under the door. Not pushed by wind, placed. I walked to it, each step slow. The note had only 2 words. He's awake. A cold ache spread through my stomach. Every door in the hallway began to rattle softly. Not violently, not frantically. Just enough to sound like someone trying each handle one by one. As if taking attendance. I stepped back from the rattling doors, my pulse loud enough to drown out everything else. Each handle twitched gently, like someone testing them in perfect sequence, left side, right side, back again. No slamming. No chaos. Just, checking. Like a teacher taking roll call in an empty hallway. I forced myself to breathe and called out softly, "Hello? Who's there?" The rattling stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt alive, heavy, listening. I turned toward the principal's office door, the one that had slammed shut moments earlier. The note at my feet, "He's awake," lay still on the floor like it belonged there. I knelt slowly and picked it up. The paper was warm. Not from the lights, not from my hand, warm like someone had been holding it just seconds before I reached it. My throat tightened. I stood and slowly pushed the office door open. It swung lightly, as if nothing had touched it. The room inside looked exactly as it should, tidy desk, chair, framed certificates on the wall, blinds half closed. But the air felt wrong. Too thick in some corners, too thin in others. Like the room had been breathing. My flashlight skimmed across the desk, a neatly arranged set of pens, a cold cup of coffee, and a stack of referral slips. Everything looked untouched. Except for one thing, the intercom button. The red indicator light was on. The intercom only lit up when someone pressed the main switch in the hallway. But I hadn't touched it, and no one else was here. A soft crackle came through the office speaker. Static at first, then a low hum, then something like a voice buried under a blanket. I stepped closer. "Daniel?" I whispered without meaning to. The static shifted. A slow scrape of sound rose beneath it, like nails dragging lightly across wood. Then a voice, faint, strained, almost childlike, pushed through the static. "Present." I froze. The word was quiet, but it filled the room like it had weight. "Daniel," I whispered again, trying to stay steady. "Where are you?" The intercom hissed softly, then clicked off, silence. I stepped back from the desk. My eyes drifted around the room, unsure of what I was looking for, a shadow, a movement, anything. But everything stayed still. Until I turned toward the door, and saw him. A figure standing exactly where the hallway light met the office darkness. Tall, thin, head slightly lowered, arms too long for his silhouette. A boy's shape, but stretched, distorted, softened at the edges like he wasn't entirely in this world. His hair hung forward, hiding his face. But I felt him watching me, waiting. "Daniel?" My voice cracked more than I wanted. He stepped forward. Not aggressively, not erratically, just one slow, purposeful step. Enough to make the floorboards creak. Enough to tell me he wasn't a shadow. "Daniel," I whispered again. "What happened to you?" His head lifted slightly, just enough for me to see. Nothing, no eyes, no features. Just a smooth, blurred surface, like a painting smeared before it dried. He raised an arm, and pointed to the desk behind me. I turned slowly. The folder I'd seen earlier, the incident report from 10 years ago, was lying open on the principal's desk. Only one line was visible, one I hadn't read before. "The child keeps entering rooms no one opens." My breath caught, the file shifted. Pages turned on their own, a second line appeared. "He is locked inside and outside at the same time." I took a step back. The office floor groaned behind me. I turned. Daniel was closer, too close. His head tilted, like he was trying to understand me. Like he expected something. Like he was waiting for me to say a name on a list. A soft voice, barely a breath, reached my ear. "Your turn." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair. The office lights flickered violently, then went dark. Only my flashlight remained, flickering, unsteady, as Daniel leaned forward, hand reaching toward me. I didn't think, I ran. Out of the office, down the hallway, past the records room, past the bulletin board with the blurred figure in the photo. My footsteps echoed like they were trying to outrun me. Behind me, the intercom clicked on again. Then a voice, distant, weak, and unmistakably young, whispered through every speaker in the school. "Present." I burst through the front doors of the building, cold night air hitting me hard. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot, chest burning and hands shaking so violently I dropped my keys twice. When I finally got inside my car, I looked back. The school was still dark, quiet. But one light was on. The principal's office window glowed softly. And for a moment, just a second, I saw a shape standing behind the blinds. Tall, thin, head lowered, taking attendance.